The entire platoon laughed when they saw how he held the rifle. By the time they stopped laughing, not one of them could look him in the eye. That moment, that careless burst of laughter echoing across the dust of Fort Bragg's training yard would stay with every soldier present, long after the gunpowder smell faded. Because the man they laughed at wasn't holding that rifle wrong. He was holding it the way a legend had taught him. And that legend had a name every soldier in that yard already knew: Carlos Hathcock. But before the name, there was the grip. And before the grip, there was Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, a man who had spent 12 years in the United States Army, becoming absolutely, dangerously certain that he knew what right looked like. Marcus had earned that certainty. 12 years of service, 3 deployments, expert marksman qualification for consecutive cycles. He had trained under the finest weapons instructors the Army had produced, men who had carried rifles in places where a wrong trigger pull meant something no manual could prepare you for. So when the older man across the yard raised that worn rifle with his thumb curled deliberately over the bore line, violating virtually every regulation Marcus had been trained to enforce, something in his chest tightened with the authority of a man who believes what he is about to say is a kindness. He crossed the yard. "Sergeant," he said, voice professional and even, "that grip is out of standard. You're going to cost yourself accuracy. Let me show you the correct position." The older man did not lower the rifle. He settled his stance, unhurried, rooted, completely still, and squeezed the trigger 3 times. Each shot separated by the same measured pause, the same controlled exhale, the same absolute absence of wasted motion. When the target results came through, Marcus looked at the grouping and felt his certainty do something it was not accustomed to doing. It faltered. 3 rounds, 800 meters. A cluster so tight the holes nearly overlapped a triangle a man could cover with 2 fingers. In field conditions, with a grip every manual would have marked incorrect, the yard had gone completely still. Stay with me, because what happens next is the part that changes how you think about everything you believe you know. And before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. The older man set the rifle down and turned around. His name was Master Sergeant Raymond Collier, retired, 66 years old, brought back to Fort Bragg as a civilian consultant, a formality most younger soldiers had already dismissed. He had the kind of face weathered into something beyond age. Not old, permanent. He looked at Marcus steadily. "Tell me, Sergeant," he said, his quiet voice carrying across the yard without effort, "what do you know about Carlos Hathcock?" Every soldier present knew that name. Carlos Hathcock was not folklore. He was a United States Marine Corps staff sergeant who served in Vietnam and became, by documented record, one of the most disciplined marksmen in American military history. 93 confirmed kills. But the numbers were never the real story. The real story was the crawl. Hathcock once received a mission most men would have called a death sentence, stated politely. A high-value enemy general, heavily protected, operating from a completely exposed position with no covered approach. Hathcock crawled through elephant grass for 3 full days, moving sometimes inches per hour, controlling his breathing so precisely the grass barely shifted around him to reach a position that every calculation said was unreachable. He reached it. He took the shot. He withdrew. He survived. The enemy called him Long-Ter and White Feather. They put a bounty on his head worth years of wages. They sent dedicated sniper teams to find and kill him. They never collected. "I know who he was," Marcus said. His voice had lost its earlier authority. Collier picked up the rifle again, not to fire, but to show, thumb resting along the bore line. That same position that had drawn Marcus across the yard minutes ago. "Every instructor you've had taught you the standard grip," Collier said. And they were right. The standard works for most people, most conditions, most weapons. He looked at Marcus directly. But here is what the standard cannot account for. Around them, the yard had quietly filled. 3 younger soldiers stood at the edges. A warrant officer near the vehicle bay had stopped walking. Nobody pretended not to listen anymore. Hathcock's hands weren't built to the dimensions the manual was written for. The rifles he carried after days of crawling, dehydration, sustained stress no training fully replicates, behaved differently than range rifles. And in Vietnam, in the grass, in the heat, one law replaced every regulation he'd ever been issued. Collier paused. "Results kept you alive. Doctrine got you killed." Marcus stood very still. He was thinking about 12 years of corrections offered across yards like this one. Every redirected grip, every cited regulation, every moment he had stood in exactly this posture, certain, authoritative, helpful, and guided someone back toward the standard. He was thinking about how a man can study something long enough that he begins to mistake the map for the ground itself. He thought about Hathcock in the grass. No manual to consult. No instructor beside him. Nothing but understanding so deep it had become instinct, and instinct so refined it had become something that didn't fit cleanly into any regulation ever written. He didn't grip the rifle that way because he hadn't been taught correctly, Collier continued. He gripped it that way because he understood the weapon beyond what the manual addresses. The living version, the one that exists at 800 meters in wind, after 72 hours without sleep. When you have for seconds before the target moves and the mission fails, he set the rifle down. Hathcock said the rifle doesn't care about your technique. It cares about your intention. The bullet goes where the barrel points. The barrel goes where your understanding sends it. The yard was completely still. I was wrong to approach you the way I did, Marcus said quietly. Collier shook his head, and something formally correct in his expression eased into something warmer. Don't apologize for engaging. The soldiers I worry about are the ones who watch something they don't understand and say nothing, who file it away as wrong and walk on. He glanced at the younger soldiers gathered at the edges. You saw something outside your framework and moved toward it. That's a soldier's instinct. Don't bury it. Redirect it. They spent 2 more hours on the range together. Collier walked Marcus through the mechanics patiently, the way the grip shifted recoil management along a specific axis, the way it reduced muzzle climb under particular barrel weights, the way it interacted differently with a rifle carried hard across difficult terrain. What had looked like a violation slowly resolved into something else entirely. A deliberate, field-tested, combat-proven solution that a man had developed in conditions where an incorrect answer wasn't a lower score, it was a name added to a casualty list. The younger soldiers who had gathered stayed through all of it. Nobody ordered them to. They simply recognized, the way soldiers sometimes do, that something was being transmitted that would not appear in any curriculum. Marcus didn't change his grip. That was never the point. His grip was correct for his hands, his weapon, his training. Collier had never suggested otherwise. But something changed in how tightly he held his certainty about everyone else's. When Collier packed his equipment, Marcus walked with him toward the gate. Why take the consultation? Marcus asked. You've got nothing left to prove. Collier was quiet. For 20 meters of Fort Bragg asphalt, the base moved around them, vehicles, personnel, the layered machinery of a military installation that never fully stops. Late light moved long and golden across the yard where the afternoon had changed something. Hathcock kept shooting until his body wouldn't let him, Collier finally said. Not because he needed the practice. Because the moment you decide you've learned enough is the moment you start losing what you built. He shifted the rifle case on his shoulder. And because occasionally, a sharp sergeant crosses a yard to correct me and I get to remember what it felt like to be at the beginning of understanding something. He paused at the gate. That's worth the drive. Every time, he walked through and didn't look back. Marcus stood there a moment, the bass noise returning around him, target results folded in his hand. He looked at them once more. 3 holes, barely wider than a quarter, 800 meters, and put them carefully in his pocket. Some things you keep. The greatest soldiers were not great because they followed every regulation without question. They were great because they understood every regulation deeply enough to know when the situation was asking for something the regulation had never been written to address. Mastery is not compliance. It is comprehension so complete that you can hear when the truth has moved beyond the manual and the courage to follow it there. Hathcock crawled 3 days through impossible ground because he understood, below doctrine and above instinct, exactly what the mission required. Not what the textbook said, what the ground said. Sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is set down the certainty we've earned, stand still in the unfamiliar, and listen for what the ground is actually telling us. If this story hit differently than you expected, tell me in the comments. Subscribe if you're not here yet. Every week, stories like this one, real, human, worth your time.